Putin, to me, is he is a traditional conservative, nationalistic Russian leader, and that is the norm historically. The reserves of the country, I mean, what hadn't been spent had been looted, and Russia was bankrupt. Russia was bankrupt. The Soviet Union went bankrupt. The Vladimir Putin of today is very different from the Vladimir Putin that came to power in 2000. He has a mission. He had a mission. And his mission was to save Russia. His mission to be a gatherer of the Russian land. Russia is the suffering, Christ-like uh, figure that is, that will save the decadent Europeans, the corrupt Europeans from their own, weakness. It's always dangerous for the world when the Russians are too happy.
Today, I'm joined by Andrew Kuchins, a top expert on U.S.-Russia relations and also former head of Carnegie Moscow Center. We talk about his time in Russia during the fall of USSR. Then we dive into Putin's persona and attempt to understand Russia and their goals on the geopolitical arena. Lastly, we discuss Ukraine and what can we expect going forward. How does Andrew predict the negotiations going? And given that this is a new channel, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment to let me know what you think and what other guests would you like to see on this podcast. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for joining me on Untangling Podcast. I know it's been your life's calling to study the post-Soviet space and Russia in particular, and your career has been quite successful. So I'd love to learn why you chose this direction and perhaps some of the highlights of your career.
I was, if we go back to when I was 13 years old in 1972, and I was kind of a politically precocious kid. And I was very excited when Nixon and Kissinger went to China. And that year they also started détente with the Soviet Union. And then Kissinger kind of looked like my dad, actually. He was kind of pudgy and curly hair, glasses, some of which I have, although I have my head shorn today. And so I kind of identified with this guy, and he was really he became a superstar, like a rock star at that time, and particularly with his Middle East shuttle diplomacy. I was very impressed that this guy that looked like my dad was dating Hollywood starlets, and these super babes, as in my 13-year-old head. Still hasn't changed much being 66, but and he'd had this wonderful statement where he said, "Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac." And it's like, yeah, I want to be this guy. I actually had an opportunity to sit next to him at lunch in China about 10 years ago, and I'd met him before because he was on the board of the Center for Strategic and National Studies, where I ran the Russia-Eurasia program at that time. But we were chatting. I said, such an honor to sit with you, and you were my idol as a young kid, and really it was my aspiration to meet what you did. It kind of lit the fire on international relations in my head, and I wanted to get into the field. But I got to ask you a question. Did you really say that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac? And he looked at me. He looked at me with a little sparkle in his eye, and he said, "I'm afraid I did." All right. So that was the beginning. I went off to college, and it was the fall of 77, actually, in the spring of 78. And I knew that I wanted to do international relations, but I really didn't have a direction at that time. And I was taking a course on Russian history that spring, and I'd always had an interest in Russia, going back to when I was about 13. Part of it having to do with Kissinger, part of it having to do with playing piano. Actually, the first piece of music I ever learned how to play was was a very simplified version of a Dmitry Shostakovich um, song or tune, and it was very melancholy, and there's something about it, the Russian soul and all that. It resonated. But I had lunch with these three other kids, young people that had just got back from Leningrad, a semester abroad in Leningrad, and it was right around finals time, and I'd never met these kids before, and I never actually talked to them again, and I couldn't tell you what their names were. But this conversation had a dramatic impact on my life. And we talked for about 2 hours, and it was that time like a bolt, a lightning bolt from God to me that, okay, you're going to be a Russian studies major. You're going to go to the Soviet Union, and that's what you're going to do. And frankly, that is what I did. I started studying Russian in the fall of the next year. I was at Amherst College, and Russian language was really, really a tough workout, I will say. I did the second year at Middlebury College, and I call it Gulag Middlebury. But I gutted it out, and became a Russian. I was a Russian studies major. I didn't go to the Soviet Union before I graduated because one, I wanted to write an honors thesis, and two, I was captain of the track team, and uh, so I ended up going actually to the Soviet Union in the fall. I'd visited there for 3 weeks in January, right after the 2 days after the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, and then went back for the fall of '81, right after I graduated, and studied at the Pushkin Institute in Moscow, which ironically, my future wife, Lilia, she lived like right across the street from the Pushkin Institute. Of course, I didn't. Maybe we saw each other. She was 10 years younger, so I was like 12 years old. But and so spending that time there, it really solidified the language and kind of confirmed my direction, I would say. I almost decided to take a job with I think it was the Moscow News as a translator. It was a very interesting time to be there. Although, the first time I went to the Soviet Union was 2 days after they'd invaded Afghanistan, and everyone said, "Oh, Andy, what an interesting time to be going to the Soviet Union, to going to Moscow."
How
And
did
uh,
people approach you, given that you were from the United States and in USSR was like the enemy country? Uh,
oh, well, then we Americans were like we were venerated like rock stars there. There were some people, the fartsovshiks, the black marketeers, they wanted to buy our jeans and whatever else we had that was of
the
value to them.
contraband.
I had brought a brand new Sony Walkman, which at the time was a very high tech, super hot thing. Small tape recorder that you had earphones for, um, and I sold that for I think 500 rubles, which is an enormous sum of money. That was like 4 months' salary for a normal worker, and I actually found it difficult to spend that money. But so that was one thing. There are lots of people that wanted to talk to you to practice their English.
Mhm.
And boy, you run into some very, very odd English speakers there. Like, I remember one guy had learned English from a Russian American joke book, military joke book. It just so that was one way. And then there were, women that wanted to meet you to get out of the country. And in fact, my one of my Russian instructors, right as I was graduating from Amherst in the spring, they had me over for this vodka infused lunch, and they pitched to me that we would love for you to meet the daughter of a very good friend of ours, and she wants to leave the country, and uh, and I said, well, I'll meet her. Um, and I mentioned this to my parents when I got home, and they almost had strokes. They were they were ready to call the university and to complain and da 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 da. And I kind of talked them down. But I mean, to me, going over there, it was like a surreal Soviet Disneyland. I mean, it was, it was very, very gray. It was, pretty much, uh, you know, to look at. It, lived up to the stereotypes of the time. Um, there were goods were very, very scarce. Almost everything was in deficit at that time. And so those two visits that I had, one while I was an undergrad, and particularly the one I was there for the semester, my takeaway was that the only major international experience I'd had was going to Mexico a number of times as a kid. I grew up in California, and to me, it was like a big cold Mexico. I.e., it was like a middle income country, uh, and the sort of the relative poverty was very, very striking to me. And and I knew at that time that people were taking trains from all over the provinces to come into Moscow to go shopping. And I was wondering, where the hell are they going shopping? I mean, because from what I can tell, there's just not much available. Uh, uh, and we had some of the meals I ate in the cafeteria, some of them we prepared for themselves. So I was doing shopping. Um, so that was quite striking. But the hook, Dorina, was the people. Um, and at that time it was still the Soviet Union, and to meet for Soviet citizens to meet with foreigners, it was a big deal. We had to call them not from the payphone in the Pushkin Institute, because of course that was being listened to, and maybe everything was being listened to that was nearby. But when we went to someone's apartment, we had to be very quiet, uh, not reveal that they were meeting with foreigners. Um, so it was kind of exotic in that regard. But what was so striking was how important friendships were, and personal relationships were for the Russians and others that we met in Moscow, and I found that really rewarding. And I guess it kind of led to me kind of thinking or realizing that you know uh, and that you know Russians, Ukrainians, and others in the Soviet Union. Um, there's a wider spectrum of expression, at a human level, at an artistic level, musical level, all across the board. And it's like, I don't know, this will sound a little bit racist, but for white people, they're white people, but they have a different mentality. They look at things differently, and especially the cultural differences are very stark between, I would say, Russians and Americans. Part of it, one side of it is the history of autocracy, and um, it's like 180 degrees opposite of the U.S. experience. For your typical traditional Russian, democracy is chaos, it's anarchy, it's unpredictable, right? Um, and then from a geostrategic standpoint, which is really where my work and interests have always been, Russia it's a continental power, and it has had it is flat. It has been, their borderlands have been constantly contested over centuries. In fact, it's a remarkable story how in beginning in the 14th century, this little principality of Muscovy, and in the kind of an isolated area of well, it wasn't considered Europe at that time at all. How it expanded it to become this Eurasian superpower is an extraordinary story. Um, I teach a course at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies now. Uh, this is the second year I've taught it on basically it's called Ukraine and Russia. Sovereignty clashes with empire. And so it looks at the history of Ukraine and Russia right back to the very beginnings of Kievan Rus. And whenever I teach the history of Russian foreign policy, or Russian political economy, I go back to the beginning and I said, look, if we were in Las Vegas, imagine we're around a round table in Las Vegas in the 14th century, and we're making bets about who's going to become the Eurasian superpower, in the coming centuries. Do you think many people would have bet on the Principality of Muscovy? you know,
Yeah.
so it's a remarkable story of expansion and resilience, and uh, uh, and so that is all of, I'm kind of going on and on, but it's kind of starting to understand in a much deeper way, what is the Russian experience and how culturally, historically, geographically, it is just so different, almost polar opposites of the American experience, with the one exception, of course, that you know the U.S. went west and manifest destiny in taking over the continent, and the Russians went east and south um, in their experience.
Given that you teach history, what did you think of Putin's history lesson with Tucker Carlson?
Oh, well, um, uh, Putin to me is he is a traditional conservative nationalistic Russian leader, and that is the norm historically,
Hmm.
uh, and particularly you know leaders that have long tenures as leaders. I wrote an article last year. It kind of went back and went through all of them, and Putin is not out of the norm at all. I mean, the two that are really out of the norm are Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Um, you know, uh, and it's. I think that understanding history deeply is just absolutely essential for being able to understand, probably any place that you're really studying. It's just happened that my experience has been the place that I've focused on has been Russia and Eurasia. Um, so Putin's uh, his interview with Tucker Carlson. I said, I joked with my class. I said, well, this course in a way is going to be like a longer version of the Tucker Carlson with Vladimir Putin, but we're going to provide a couple of different perspectives. And by the way, the Ukrainian perspective is extremely different from the Russian perspective. And getting back to Putin's other, his famous essay he wrote uh, published in July of 2021 about sort of Ukrainian Russian history. And basically, the argument is that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. And I said, well, that's his hypothesis, and in this class, we're going to find out just how and why they aren't the
Yeah.
same people. um,
Yeah, I think you talked a little bit about understanding a place and how important it is. I feel like in the West, there is a tendency to apply your worldview and your values on everybody else. And I feel like Putin is often misunderstood because you can't really apply that Western worldview on him. What do you think are kind of main, I guess, like views of Putin's or personality traits that West is missing or not understanding as well?
um, well, I think it kind of gets back to as a starting point that as I said before, that Putin is the norm uh, in Russia historically. Uh, uh, you know, Russians have an extraordinarily territorial sense of security, and it's you can understand why. I mean, they live on the steppe. It's flat. In the 13th century, they're overrun by the Mongols. And actually, the Mongol spirit experience had a very, very important impact uh, on how the Russians, their mode of governance, their how they kind of view the world strategically. It gave them actually a model of empire, um, and the idea of empire. Actually, how Genghis Khan came up with the idea of empire, from such an obscure place in Mongolia is an amazing thing. Um, so that's one. Uh, I think that people. I think if you have a longer view of Russian history, you're more likely to understand in a more deep way, the political culture of Russia, and that it's very different um, from that of Europe, and of course the United States. When Putin came to power rather quickly and surprisingly. You know, okay, he was a KGB agent. We all know his only foreign experience was in Dresden in 1986 to 1990, as the Soviet Union was falling apart. The Warsaw Pact fell apart. And then, of course, he had been he'd been in the law school at St. Petersburg State University. Well, of course, when he was there, with Leningrad State University. Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, had been his professor at Leningrad State. And he came back. Well, he initially got a job actually at St. Petersburg State University in the international relations department, but then shortly after that, he started working for Mayor Sobchak in St. Petersburg, and that got him into government, obviously. And he proved himself, I think, at the time he's a guy that could get things done. And he was a guy that would stay back in the shadows. Um, he would be the guy you're in a room with people in a meeting, and he's the guy that you wouldn't notice, or you're less likely to notice. Uh, and that served him very well in St. Petersburg. And he made a lot of very useful connections that would essentially be the core of his, close political confidants when he came to Moscow. Now, Sobchak was not reelected in 1996. Putin found himself in the rather unusual position of running his political campaign, which he did not see himself as suited for, and it was a failure. But the guy suddenly found himself without a job, and and uh, and here is where the remarkable ascension of Vladimir Putin begins, and he had been, I think it was Alexei Kudrin, later his finance minister, that invited him down to Moscow. And Putin, I think, was sleeping on Kudrin's couch in his apartment, and and Putin got a job working for Pavel Borodin, who ran he had a very lucrative position in basically managing all of the real estate and the property of the Russian government, and that was a very, very lucrative and powerful position. And Putin did well with that in a short period of time. Um, in a, you know, I mean, to make the story relatively short, uh, he um, he went back to his initial organization, or the successor organization of the KGB, the FSB. He became the head of the FSB. And then he became the prime minister. All of this within 3 years of basically being, I mean, he was a mediocre intelligence agent. He was not a, he was, he was a lieutenant colonel. He was not like a superstar. He was not a general like his, his close friend Sergei Ivanov, who had been the resident in the court of Saint James in Great Britain.
Mhm.
I heard this was in the fall of 2007. I heard Ivanov describe himself that way, and it was that day Sergei Ivanov had just found out that he would not be the successor to Vladimir Putin, and he put on quite a performance. But he started with that point that, I was a resident, I was a KGB general, and he didn't have to say, but the clear, implication was that, uh, I was not a nobody like Vladimir Putin was. So I guess this is to kind of accent that that Putin's rise was rapid, almost miraculous in retrospect. And then of course on December 31st, 1999, the alien Boris Yeltsin, announced his resignation, and it made the prime minister Vladimir Putin the acting president.
Mhm.
A guy that that certainly those in the West knew very, very little about, and I think most Russians didn't know all that much about at that time.
I think when I was looking at his biography, something that I found very striking, I think like loyalty was the number one value for Putin. He was just there to be an effective sort of like kind of like sidekick for the people that he was working for. But then I feel like that just allowed him to get a lot of referrals and introductions. And I think with Boris Yeltsin, there was a scandal that he helped him deal with very effectively and ruthlessly. And it just seems like he never let a chance slip by without using it to further advance himself.
Yes, I think I completely agree with you, Dorina. I think that the Yeltsin and the Yeltsin's family were impressed how loyal Putin was to Sobchak, um, and if that is the prime mm, criteria that the family and Yeltsin were looking for in a successor, somebody that would be loyal to Yeltsin, somebody that would protect Yeltsin and the family and their interests after Yeltsin retired. Yes, and the incident you're referring to was taking out uh, Mr. Skaratov. They released a sex video of Skaratov, uh, that Putin got access to, and so that was, I think it was when Putin was running the KGB. But that absolutely right. Loyalty was critical, um, and then uh, I guess those that saw themselves as the kingmakers. And there was, of course, Yeltsin's family, but there was also the figure of Boris Berezovsky, um, who always kind of inflated, I think, his importance in the Yeltsin inner circle. But he was a very significant figure, and uh, he he had a number of different valuable assets. One of them, of course, was ORT, the Russian television station. And the first thing that Putin did in coming to power was that he went after two oligarchs, Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned NTV, Independent TV, vis-a-vis Maya Televidenia, I guess, and Berezovsky. And uh, that was a way for him. One, he saw that the power of the media was essential, and that the government needs to have greater control over the media. The government needs to have greater control over these oligarchs. And Putin understood that Russia was not a very that the rule of law was very it was a gray zone. It was just not firmly established. This was a country in transition in the 1990s, and and the tools that the executive had were quite weak. Uh, and so I think that a critical document was to look back on and understanding where Putin was coming from and what his program would be, was the so-called Millennium Statement. It was a publication that came out on December 30. Well, it actually came out a couple of days before December 31st, before Yeltsin's announcement. But it was by Putin, and it outlined his vision of the state. And that there was several key points come out. One, he makes nods towards democracy and the market economy, but the accent was really on restoring state power. I think for the Russians, I've said and written this many times, in the 1990s were like a smutnaya время, a time of troubles. I would say the first one, of course, was in the turn of the century, 17th century. Government, state power collapses. Foreign powers have dramatically increased influence in Russia. And of course, in the 17th century, it was the dreaded Poles, so that was terrible from a Russian standpoint. Disease, etc. And the second time, of course, was the World War I and especially the Civil War period and the Bolshevik Revolution. And the third period was the 1990s. Again, it was absence, state power collapses. The economy was in extremely a difficult position. And thirdly, and foreigners, especially the United States and the West, had a lot of too much influence on Russian economic and political policy, especially economic policy. There was the term the Washingtonsky Obkom, like the Washington regional committee in Soviet terms, that was essentially running a lot of major policy decisions in Russia in the 1990s. And it was because of the economic leverage that the multilateral institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, but mostly more the IMF, had on Russia. And so you had to restore state power. You had to strike, no more revolutions. No more revolutions. We need to stabilize things. And, and that Russia is a great power. Russia has always been a great power, but it's in a very dangerous position right now. It's in a moment of extreme weakness. And we see czars and Russian leaders, Soviet leaders, from Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great to Stalin, kind of invoke this, that we are behind. And the other great powers are ahead of us, and we need to catch up. There was an element of that in what Putin had to say. And so what he wrote, to me, as a political scientist, I thought it was brilliant in that it captured, I think, where what most Russians were feeling at that time. And to get back to your question about what the West did not understand well enough was just how traumatic the collapse of the Soviet Union was. One day you're a superpower, and the next day you're a recipient of humanitarian aid, and you're worried about famine in the country, and then the only way to and there was almost nothing available in the stores in 1990 and 1991, and the only way to get things to be available was to liberalize prices, and they did, and so there was massive inflation, but the goods did become available, and starvation didn't happen. But I think and I told this all the time to to mainly to U.S. audiences when I was in Europe, to European audiences, especially for Americans. We just could not imagine what that was like. It's just not in our. It's not in our historical memory. And Putin always played very well on that understanding. And I think the second thing that I'll stop for you is that uh, I understood. A relatively young guy. I was 32 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I was just defending my dissertation, but I wasn't particularly well known. I was not a well-known figure in the field of Soviet studies at that time. I was sort of like an emerging guy. Was that uh, things were, um, Boris Yeltsin said in a famous speech in October of 1991 that, things may be quite tough for 6 or 9 months, but then they're going to get better. Well, that was BS. Uh, Decisions for 74 years about allocations of economic goods have been made on a non-market basis in a perverted price structure. And once that was removed, then that would expose all the misallocations that had been made for decades. And suddenly they're in a market economy. And so to me, things were going to get quite a bit worse. And so whoever was associated with that politically, they're going to suffer. Okay, yeah, I understand Yeltsin saying that. He's a politician. Soviet leaders have been saying for years, well, things are tough now, but we're heading towards the glorious, communist future. Um, so I understand he couldn't say that, but we should have understood that better. And I think that we got too politically attached, frankly, to, Boris Yeltsin and the reformers, um, and even Yegor Gaidar, when he became acting prime minister in December of 1991, he said he doubted that he would be in power in a year from now because he saw what was coming. He understood. In fact, when he got into power, he saw things were actually worse because basically the reserves of the country, I mean, what hadn't been spent had been looted, and Russia was bankrupt. Russia was bankrupt. The Soviet Union went bankrupt, um, and uh, and so of course things got worse, and those in power took the heat, and then since we were associated with, we the Americans in particular, since we were so closely associated with the reformers, we took the heat as well. Um, and that set up things for the narrative that the West, and particularly the Americans, were trying to weaken us. They're trying to weaken us. They don't really care about democracy. What they care about is a weak Russia. And Putin played that note beautifully. It really worked for him politically, and it still does.
Interesting, because I was doing some research, and I feel like the biggest turning point in the U.S.-Russia relations came a little bit later, after Putin's been in power for 5 to 7 years. At first, he was attempting to become closer with the West, and then he felt rejected. Do you feel like when Putin just came to power, there was always uh, a big distrust to the West, or did he genuinely try to become sort of like a Western country?
Well, I think you used the word, I think in your introduction, Darina, about an evolution of Vladimir Putin. And there has absolutely been an evolution of Putin, and particularly about his. The Vladimir Putin of today is very different from the Vladimir Putin that came to power in 2000. And I would, I would characterize Vladimir Putin. Um, he was an economic reformer. He understood that the Soviet system was completely bankrupt and had bankrupted the country, um, and uh, and he understood that it was very important for for Russia to have constructive relations with Europe and with the United States. I mean, that is historically always been kind of the first orientation of Russia. Um, and where we see Russia today is very historically anomalous, where they're so alienated from from the West, more so than I think at any time during their history. So, famously, when 9/11 happened, Putin was the first world leader to phone up George W. Bush and express his condolences and say that Russia would, do whatever it could to help the United States. And actually, the help that Russia provided, in my view, was more significant in taking down the Taliban in Afghanistan. Because of the Russian ties with the Northern Alliance. And Russian intelligence support, logistical support, allowing for the use of bases in Central Asia. I know the Central Asian states were sovereign independent states, but it was exceedingly important for for the Russians to that they supported that. And I think that the support that the Russians provided, in the fall of 2001 after the attack, was as, if not more significant than any other U.S. ally in the defeat of the Taliban. And it was, there had been, of course, a lot of excitement in the collapse of the Soviet Union that there could be a robust um, security relationship between the United States and Russia. Uh, and this hope was lit again. I remember very well. Um, and during that fall, that wow, okay, this is an opportunity, for us to build on this and to have a more robust security relationship with Russia. And of course, that didn't come to pass. And the beginning of Vladimir Putin's grievances against the United States began then. The United States announced in the fall of '01 that it was going to withdraw from the ABM treaty, which for the Russians was a keystone, always a keystone to their security, very, very fundamentally, because their conventional, um, you know, uh, the conventional military side of Russia, which had been so strong in the Soviet Union, had virtually collapsed, and so they were really, really that much more dependent upon their nuclear deterrent. And there was a very, very strong. The Russians were always more or more confident about the Americans' ability to build missile defense systems, maybe than the Americans themselves. And so that was a big blow. And then, of course, the second round of NATO expansion was announced. And there's one thing that every Russian leader from Gorbachev on has been opposed to. It has been the expansion of the territory of NATO. What has been less well understood is that the expansion of the mission of NATO to conduct operations out of territory, out of NATO territory, and that it wasn't just a defense alliance. And of course, this became uh, brutally apparent to the Russians in our war against Serbia in 1999. So those two things happened, and
Do you think it was
okay,
a mistake?
The Iraq War was Putin was like, look, George. I mean, he and Bush, they had a nice chemistry, those two, at least until the Orange Revolution. Um, they're both. Uh, George W. Bush has a very, very funny story in his memoirs about Putin. That this was when he first went to Nova Ogareva, Putin's house just outside of Moscow, um, and Putin had already been to the White House. And I met with George W. Bush um, in the Oval Office. One time I've been in the Oval Office in June of 2006, and he told this story. That well, usually Barney is running around the Oval Office. Barney was W's dog, cute little kind of like cockapoo. not a big dog. And when Vladimir was here, Vladimir, he always referred to Putin as Vladimir. Vladimir met Barney, and then when I went to meet Putin at his house a few years later. Putin's, I mean, you have to both Bush is sitting in one of the chairs in the Oval Office, and Condi's sitting in the other chair, and five of us so-called Russia experts are sitting on these two couches, and then there's the peanut gallery of like the National Security Advisor and and others, in this pretty intimate gathering as he tells this story. And I'm sure he's told it many, many times, and he tells it in his memoirs as well. That well, Putin called for his dog. Of course, it was Coney at the time. It was a lab. And Bush says, and suddenly I heard this, and he's hitting his thighs like this, and this huge dog comes into the room. And Vladimir turns to me and he says, bigger, stronger, faster than Barney.
That's so funny. So I was just curious, when you met Putin in person, what did you think of his presence in the room, and what was your impression?
Yeah. So I'd been in a large room with him several times when I was running the Carnegie Moscow Center, 2003 2005. But when I was invited to the Valdai Discussion Club meetings beginning in 2006, and actually it was at Nova Agariova, where we were in a pretty intimate setting, about 35, 40 of us Westerners, mostly Brits and Americans, combination of journalists and uh, uh, so-called experts, I'll say. Um, so first of all, Putin kept us waiting for 2 hours or so, which is par for the course for Vladimir. It's his little power play. Um, and we are we're there for something in between lunch and dinner, and the table is very formally set. I think a 5-course meal. I've got the menu around, um, and Putin sits down with us, and for 3.5 hours or so, maybe 4 hours, but that was sort of the average, particularly in the beginning. That he would take any question from us, any question, and and he had no notes, he had no aid, and he would answer every question. It's pretty remarkable. I don't know of any other world leader that, that's certainly a leader of a great power that was willing to have that kind of meeting. It was part of basically a public relations campaign on the part of the Russians to improve their image. Um, so the first thing, okay, first of all, the guy's extremely smart. Um, he has close to a photographic memory, I would say, and he's very, very effective at pairing questions and deflecting questions, and um, I mean, most of us are trying to play gotcha, you know, to have him. I'll give you an example. I remember the first question that I asked him. I said, well, Vladimir Vladimirovich, and I asked him in Russian. Um, when I was living here for 3 years, I watched the Russian news every day, and from watching the news, I would have concluded that Russia viewed the United States as its enemy. But I know that your policy is much more pragmatic, and you're interested in a constructive relationship with the United States. How do you explain this seeming contradiction? Um, and he said, "Well, you know, um, the news must be attuned to public opinion."
Mm.
Essentially, what he said. I thought, a quite clever response. But that's just an example. The second thing, noticing in this first meeting in particular, the room was very hot, and we were all in business attire, and So it was so hot that about half the room was taking off their jackets, if there were men or if there were a woman, that had a jacket on, which was a breach of protocol, uh, or they were visibly uncomfortable. And I was in the latter category. Vladimir, on the other hand, was cool as a cucumber. There was no evidence that he was uncomfortable in this room. And I was really struck by this. I thought, wow, this must be some kind of KGB training, or he's taken some kind of pill that lowers his body temperature. And it would be a classic Russian play, on well, one, we're served all, it's a 5 course, like 3-star Michelin guide uh, restaurant meal, and he brings out the chef, his Italian chef, and there's all kinds of wine and vodka and brandy served. Putin only took one symbolic a small sip of wine, and certainly I was not. I don't know if anyone was drinking heavily, but it was there, and it's kind of and that's also so. All right, let those Westerners, drink and have them be slightly off their game. Let's turn up the heat on them to make them uncomfortable. And Putin, um, it was kind of, he was like dry. There was this reptilian quality to him that was, and he was, and the other thing was sort of his physical demeanor. He was poised, like a tiger. I could just tell. I'm an old athlete, and I could just see the way he was sitting. Like, the balls of his feet were up, and his legs were tensed. So he was. Everyone says he has this training, his martial arts training, in which he can really control himself. But what struck me was that he was like poised and ready to pounce if need be. Now, a lot of other times when we see him in public, he kind of sort of sits back, and I think that developed longer he was in power. It's like, okay, hit me with your best shot. uh, and I've seen 5 U.S. presidents, and I've seen so many European leaders. He said famously a few years after, I think it was around 2005 or so, that ever since Gandhi died, I don't really have anybody interesting to talk to. It was a joke, but it was sort of very telling, I think, about how he kind of viewed himself. And he and I think that is an important aspect about him, that he somewhere along the line he started viewing himself in kind of messianic historical terms, and that he has a mission. He had a mission, and his mission was to save Russia when he came to power. And then he saw as his mission to be a gatherer of the Russian lands, a classic Russian historical narrative. I don't know whether maybe it was Vasily Klushevsky, the first Russian historian to use that term, but no, it's not this term. It predates Klushevsky for sure, but and this is an interesting point, and of course it's extremely important vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the fact. So when the first princes of Muscovy, they saw themselves as the first gatherers of the Russian lands. Well, what were the Russian lands? These were the lands of what we called Kievan Rus. Um, uh, and so they even these lands actually, well, they weren't precisely Russian at the time, if you will. But that's the essence and the beginning of the Russian historical narrative. and most of these Russian lands, as I often joke, well, they weren't Russian until the Russians gathered them.
Yeah.
And then once they become Russian, if you've ever been a Russian land historically, then you are always a Russian land. And that is, I think, at the essence of the dispute between Ukraine and Russia.
And I think like Russian history is also often was written under the directive of the emperor or the person in charge to sort of continue this narrative that we all belong together. It was never necessarily just like a scholar out of their own volition writing free history. I feel like it often was directed to have a certain spin to it.
That's absolutely true. And it starts from the very beginning, actually. It starts in Kievan Rus. The what became known as the Russian Primary Chronicle. Um, you know, and there is, I mean, what actually happened in Kievan Rus was essentially that the Vikings, the Vikings slash Varangians, well, this would be an overstatement, but they established Kievan Rus as kind of it started as a commercial colony, sort of Vikings. And there's the first chronicles, and this started, in the ninth century, with Rurik, legendary leader. But the first chronicles were not written until early in the 12th century. So it's like more than 200 years after the fact, and they're written by Orthodox monks, because Orthodox monks are virtually the only literate people in the land. Um, and and there's the story, the foundation story, that that the Vikings arrived, and the local inhabitants, who were Eastern Slavs, and Finno-Ugric peoples, but mostly Eastern Slavs, they said, "Our land is rich and bounteous, but we are disorganized. Would you govern us?"
Yeah,
And
it's hard to believe that that's how it went exactly.
exactly, it's impossible to believe that's how it went, and that's how I start my class. Like, um, seriously, that's not how the Vikings rolled. And
Yeah.
but we know a lot about how the Vikings rolled in England and Western Europe, because there were written accounts that were done at the time. But so that's like the first lie, if you will. Or I said, you have to look at these guys as spin doctors who are spinning an historical narrative. And I guess, being founded by, or, having a very important role, founding role for non-Rus slash Russian peoples is not acceptable. Um, so we're going to invent our own version, but it just defies common sense. Exactly. Like, really? That can't be the way it went down. um, and it it goes, so there's the Normanist for anti-Normanist, theories. And the Normanist theories is that the Normans, the Vikings, the Northmen, played an important role. And where does the name Rus come from? Well, Rus is, I think, it's a Finnish term for those who row. Well, those who row were the Vikings. They weren't the Eastern Slavs and Finno-Ugric peoples living in the territory. And so, at any rate, the Russian Primary Chronicle version, for centuries was dominant. It was like the only story in town. And then there was this German scholar, apparently in the late 18th century, during Catherine the Great's time, that was doing research in the archives in St. Petersburg, and he was the first to articulate the Normanist theory that the Vikings, played a very significant role in the founding story. Well, guess what happened to him? I mean, Catherine the Great threw him out of the country. And the Soviets were just classic Russian nationalists, and they supported the anti-Normanist view very, very strongly. And it was, so even when 45 years ago, when I started studying Russian history, the anti-Normanist view was the dominant view. I mean, the dominant text was Nicholas Ryaznovsky, History of Russia. And, Ryaznovsky is a great guy. I knew him. He was a professor at Berkeley, and he had come out. He was Russian born, and he'd come out of Harbin in the after the his family in the after the revolution, and. And if you read Ryaznovsky, and now uh, the late Ryaznovsky, and he's a co-author that worked with him in some of the revised versions, Mark Steinberg. But if you still read it today, it really is very dismissive of of the the Norman theory. It's also very dismissive of the impact of the Mongols on Russian culture, which to me is absolutely contrary to fact. And um, but there you are.
Um, yeah, I completely agree. I wanted to go back to our conversation about the decline in the relations between Russia and the United States, NATO expansion and ABM. And I was wondering, what were the mistakes perhaps that on the Western side that led to this just absolutely terrible American-Russia relations? And could have it been better right now if different decisions were made, or it was just like bound to come to this point no matter what was done on the Western side?
Well, that's a great question, Dorina. Um, and I remember in 2016, I was commissioned to write a report on U.S.-Russia relations for the incoming administration. Um, and I was interested, and I'd done this several times in 2000 and 2004 and 2008, and so I was a veteran of this kind of thing. But what's striking me then was that at this time we'd had three two-term presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, that had all come into power hoping to improve relations with the Russian Federation. And by the end of their terms, relations with Russia were worse than they had ever been in their history. Um, and each one got subsequently worse. So, I, I think something, I think there's something deeply embedded here that's a problem, and uh, I think it starts at the very beginning, um, and you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union, the Russia that had merged, um, was extremely weak, and the United States was uh, at a period of historical dominance, um, maybe greater than it had ever experienced. And, we had a great 1990s in the United States. Economic growth, tech, uh, information revolution started taking off, and our power was growing extraordinarily. Um, and even while we genuinely sought to support the Russian transition, um, I think at some level we did not adequately take into account, as I said at the outset, just how difficult this was going to be. Um, Even though at the time everybody was in the early 1990s, everybody was afraid of the so-called red-brown coalition, like a coalition of revanche of communists and Russian nationalists coming together, like in Weimar Germany. Um, the that comparison is very apt, um, and it's essentially what came to pass completely. Um, and uh, the I look, I'm I'm part Polish, a quarter Polish. Kuchins is from Kuczynski. So on the NATO expansion issue, I thought I've always had mixed views on this. One, I think, look, these former Warsaw Pact countries, particularly the Warsaw Pact countries. I mean, look, they've experienced Russian imperialism in a very, very direct and negative way for centuries. Of course, they want to be associated with the West, and and I supported that, but I also understood that it was always going to be extremely difficult for the Russians to swallow. Going back to this natural, very territorial sense of security, the importance of buffer states. I mean, this is very deeply embedded in Russian strategic political culture. Um, and uh, and of course, and in 2000, it was in 2008 where we really got where the rubber really hit the road. And that was when the George W. Bush administration, he was in his last year of power in 2007 and in early in 2008, and he was pushing very hard for NATO expansion to Georgia and Ukraine. And the story that essentially the French and the Germans did not allow us to do it, and there was a split in Europe that exists to this day between the so-called New Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld termed them, the East Central European states. I mean, they weren't New Europe really historically, but they were newly part of the EU and newly part of NATO. That were more anti-Russian than the West Europe, than the traditional leaders of Europe, the Germans, the French, and to a lesser extent the Brits, but especially the French and the French and the Germans. Excuse me. And so we had the famous Bucharest conference for NATO in 2008, where Vladimir said to George W. Bush that Ukraine is not a real country. Ukraine is not a real country. And he meant it. And that was a red line for him. And at the time in 2008, it's interesting. Public opinion in Ukraine was very, very mixed. It was like split down the middle on the desire to join NATO at that time. And so I was not. I thought, no, I don't think this is a good idea now, because look, I mean, Ukrainian public opinion is split on this. But I think the bigger turning point for Putin, of course, was the Orange Revolution and his relationship with George W. Bush, and also with his perspective on the role of the Americans, that the Americans couldn't be trusted, and the Americans are trying to weaken the Russian strategic position, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we can't rerun history, but my conclusion in that 2016 report was that it was an extremely bad setup, from the beginning. The United States was on a roll. Of course, we wanted to try to stabilize Europe, and so I mean, if you go back to the beginning, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian elites, they wanted essentially NATO to be thrown into the dustbin of history, as the Warsaw Pact was. And in fact, ironically, Strobe Talbot, in January of 1991, wrote an article in Time magazine that he used that term, that NATO should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Now, ironically, a few years later, Strobe played a very significant role in the Clinton administration, promoting NATO expansion, which was very controversial in the United States at that time. And I always told the Russians, look, it's not, this is not being driven by the Pentagon. This is actually not what the Pentagon wanted. Certainly not Bill Perry's Pentagon in the 1990s. So they were working very closely with the Russians on the destruction of nuclear weapons and safety of fissile materials. And I mean, this was being driven by the demand from the countries of the region: Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, etc. So it was a really bad setup. I'm not sure how it really could have been avoided ultimately. In retrospect, it's very easy to sort of see how the sides, consistently went further against each other, and the Orange Revolution was a turning point. The Georgia War was a turning point in 2008. The demonstrations in Moscow by the opposition to the falsified Duma elections in December of 2011, that was a big turning point, and that was especially the turning point where, for Putin's first 8 years in power, I mean, his credibility as a leader was primarily because of the extraordinary economic growth that Russia was experiencing. Then nobody predicted, frankly, at that time, and nobody really expected how fast that could happen. But things started getting, then they got whopped up the side of the head in the 2008 financial crisis, the global financial crisis, which actually hurt Russia more than any other G20 country. And Putin had a choice to make. Do I want to push more deep economic reforms, marketizing reforms, which include strengthening rule of law, or to promote economic growth so that economic growth can continue to be, my main calling card for my political authority and credibility. But he turned in a different direction. He turned to, no, I'm not going to do that. I see that as too risky. Putin shifted himself, and he was basically less interested in promoting economic growth in Russia, but in controlling the growth, not growing the pie, but controlling the pie. And then for the growth, then for his power, it was going to be a more nationalist and aggressive foreign policy.
Yeah, I always found this part so interesting because I feel like in the United States, number one thing you want from your leadership is to make your life better, make it financially better. And in Russia, it's just not the case. And I think that was one of the main misunderstandings by Germany, for example. We're doing all of this economic trade and resource trade. We're buying all this oil. So Russia is going to value that so much. And it's just, what is the most important thing for Russia? Is it an idea of greatness or some sort of demand of respect to their country? How important is the financial side? I can't really make this comprehensible idea of what Russia values the most and what its secondary priorities and what's not important at all.
Great question. And I think sort of the guns or butter question. But I think when push comes to shove, Russian history and today, the sense of Russia being a great power, Mogущество, the greatness, making Russia great again, virtually always wins out. And it certainly won out in this period, this 25-year period of Vladimir Putin's rule. It's won out to such an extent that that Russia's foreign policy is more unbalanced than it ever has been in its multi-centuries history. Does Russia really want to be China's junior partner and to have its close allies Iran and North Korea? Historically, this is really just counter to Russian strategic culture. But they have, with the decision to cast the die in the war in Ukraine, starting with the seizure of Crimea in 2014. Look at the political response in Russia to that. It was like, oh my God, this is catharsis. This is like the greatest thing that's ever happened in my lifetime. And it just was a really powerful injection of support for Putin at that time. And it marked a very qualitative dip in Russia's relationship with the West, but not anything close to a break. That would come in 2022 with the the full on invasion.
Yeah. I was listening to one of the interviews of a journalist who used to be working for the like first channel of Russia, the national channel, and then sort of diverted from that and went on a tour around Russia. And she shares about this house that basically it's so old that it no longer is registered. It has to be like destroyed, but people still live there. They haven't been relocated, and they don't have any heating, any water. It's just the worst living conditions. But they purchased this ginormous Russian flag that covers the roof completely. And
That's classic.
it's just, I think it's like it's the easiest thing to feed to your people. It's like sort of the free, just sort of almost like lies about the ideology and the greatness of Russia. And why do Russian people buy that? Like you, even especially with social media, you know, you live really badly. Why doesn't it, why are people okay with that? Why do they buy this idea of greatness? If, like, how can you feel great if you have to like go outside to use the restroom and you know that that's not a norm anywhere else?
Well, that is a core question. Um, I remember in 1990, uh, the Soviet foreign minister, former leader of Georgia, Edward Shevardnadze, gave a famous speech, and it was exactly on this point. What is greatness? Um, and uh, uh, and he was, making the kind of guns versus butter question. Uh, Strategic power and fear and all of that, versus how the people actually lived, how they lived. Um, and here we have, 34 years later, 35 years later, after he gave that speech, um, we've actually come back to a situation that is, well, the situation was pretty grave in 1990. I shouldn't underestimate that. I was there. I saw it. People lived terribly, and that was the most striking thing to me when I first went to the Soviet Union in 1979, 80, and 81. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, it's like, wow, these people live like crap. Um, and it's something in the Russian political, just so I don't like using this term. It's like it's in the Russian DNA. Putin uses that DNA phrase quite a bit, but it kind of is, and we've, um, just time and time again, the choice gets made for the sense of greatness and that we are respected. No major decision in international relations can be made without the assent of Moscow or St. Petersburg before that. You can find Soviet, Russian ministers of foreign affairs over centuries, saying something to that effect. And uh, it's, I think it 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 goes back to the very beginning and the formation of from this Principality of Muscovy that was, in such in economically bad conditions, bad soil, bad weather, and yet from this seed, emerged the Eurasian superpower. And that there is a deep capacity for suffering. I know this sounds cliche, but there's a deep resilience on the part of the people. I mean, um, we look at the suffering and the loss of lives in World War II, up in the neighborhood of 30 million to defeat the Nazis. And that was the greatest achievement of Russia, I think, in the eyes of Russians, and certainly in my eyes, in their history, with the second achievement being the defeat of Napoleon. um, in 1812, uh, and that Russia. This theme comes up both in political culture as well as in artistic culture. That Russia is the suffering, Christ-like um, uh, figure that is, that will save the decadent Europeans, the corrupt Europeans from their own, weakness, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I guess it's why, and why here I am 45 years later, still just fascinated with exploring the culture and the history of Russia. I mean, it's just so incredibly rich. These larger than life figures. Um, and we are in the middle of an epic drama today uh, with the Russian showdown with Ukraine. Um, you know,
What are your thoughts on how the negotiations are going so far?
well, I'm worried. Um, uh, I just wrote the column I sent you last week, that I can see that Donald Trump actually has a lot of leverage, but I don't see any evidence that he's willing to use it. And the leverage is that if Putin doesn't, really come to the table and make serious concessions, then he can arm the Ukrainians to a much greater extent than Joe Biden did. I mean, Donald Trump can be credible in that threat, or he can simply walk away from the table. But um, I just right before our interview, I got off a, a Zoom call that the Brookings Institution does every 2 weeks on Ukraine, and it was a very interesting discussion. And I think one of the takeaways was that, and the concerns is that, okay, Donald Trump wants a ceasefire, and he doesn't really care about what the conditions are himself. He just wants a ceasefire. Now, what I think the positive thing that Zelensky has done is to say, yes, I see that. I see you want a ceasefire. I support your efforts in the ceasefire. So right now, actually, Vladimir Putin looks like the obstacle to a ceasefire and to peace negotiations. But it's I personally don't think that if Trump doesn't make credible in the eyes of Putin the threat, uh, the so-called the stick, that he has a big stick that he's ready to use on Moscow, um, then we're likely going to have reach a ceasefire that is going to be, or the negotiations. I mean, Trump wants a negotiated peace, and he doesn't really care how it happens. If it happens at the expense of the Ukrainians, and certainly all the evidence that we've seen so far suggests that he's ready for that to happen. Um, but we'll see. It's a really really critical historical moment right now, because the Atlantic Alliance is up for grabs in ways that it has not been in the last 80 years. My hope is that Trump wants to restructure the Atlantic Alliance. That I absolutely support him, and that the Europeans should be paying a much more significant part of for their own security, and that they've been free riding for too long on the United States. I think it's bad for the Europeans, and I think it's definitely bad for the United States. But do I want to see a complete rupture and breakdown of the Atlantic Alliance? No. Now, whether what Trump and his people around him actually want is not clear to me.
Mhm. Do you think if faced with the choice of doing another conscription round in Russia or coming to some concessions on the negotiation table, Putin, like how afraid is Putin of an idea of doing another conscription round, and how close are they to needing to do that?
This as that's a great question. It's actually something that came up in the Brookings call just earlier this morning, that the Russians have actually done a bit better with their recruitment on manpower, and I think it's made the conscription question uh, less urgent. It's a much bigger problem for Ukrainians, I think.
So I was curious, you mentioned that United States has a great leverage. From my understanding, that kind of the best game for Ukraine to play is to get as many weapons as they can so they could get to a point where Russia is faced with the choice of a forced conscription again. And that would be like the only point where Putin would be willing to negotiate. Is there anything else that would really bring Putin to negotiation table with an intent to change any of his demands?
Um, Likely not. Um, of course, I watch Russian news, not every day, but a lot. And boy, are those Russians happy right now? It's always
Yeah.
dangerous. It's always dangerous for the world when the Russians are too happy. um, but they're kind of their narrative, certainly that they promote. Certainly, have been very effectively promoting with Steve Witkoff and President Trump. Um, has been that look, we are winning, we are on a roll, and the Ukrainians are in disarray. Okay, the facts on the ground are okay. Yes, the Kursk, the Russians are running the Ukrainians out of Kursk, out of Russian territory, um, and I don't think the Russians would ever sign on to a ceasefire until they actually have control of their own territory again. But the much more significant line of battle, there's been very very little change there, and it's pretty stable. And so the longer Ukraine can maintain that, I mean, it is kind of a race on who is going to. It's a war of attrition, and who is going to reach the point where they're ready to cry uncle first. And the Russians have advantages there. They've always had advantages there, and that's the essence of Putin's strategy. Once the Russians weren't able to take over Ukraine immediately in the first weeks of the war, and I think that certainly as long as the United States continues providing logistical intelligence and military support for Ukraine, the Ukrainians can maintain their position. If the U.S. support were to be yanked for a longer period of time than it was a couple of weeks ago, before Zelensky agreed to support the ceasefire proposal, then that's going to puts the Ukrainians in a more difficult position, in which sometime probably in the summer it might become more evident. But the Ukrainian military production has increased dramatically over the course of the last 3 years. The Europeans actually provide more military support for Ukraine than the Americans. So I don't think there are reasons for despair, but I think that I think it's in the interest of both sides to during this calendar year to end the war.
Yeah. Do you think there is a world where Russia doesn't invade again after the peace treaty is signed?
Um, I think that I think that as long as Donald Trump is president, and if he's played a major role in this peace, Putin will not attack Ukraine. Beyond that, it's hard to say. I think the other thing that in favor of the no is just how debilitating this war has been for Russian manpower and military equipment. I mean, what they've lost in the last 3 years is not something that it can be simply, you know, re uh, found again in even 3 years. I am skeptical also that Putin is like Hitler and wants to conquer all of Europe, and that he's going to move on from Ukraine to uh, Moldova to Belarus to the Baltic states or wherever, just because there's no place in the Russian imagination as important as Ukraine, and it is nowhere close as important as Ukraine. So that's what makes me a little bit more optimistic on that score.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think the importance to Ukraine to Putin is more because of like it being a NATO threat, or is it because it's a birthplace of Russia in his eyes and a place where Russia was baptized? So,
I think it's more the latter. But the NATO question has always played a role. I think it would be is disingenuous to say that it hasn't, as many of my colleagues, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, like to argue. But I think it's mainly about identity. That's kind of what my course has turned out to be all about, which is sort of interesting. When I embarked on putting the course together, I didn't quite realize that was what it was all going to come down to. But that Ukraine is such an elemental part of the Russian self-identity, and especially the identity that Putin has chosen for, that is sort of the traditional conservative, imperial, nationalistic Russian self-identity. Um, that's he's bet the farm on that.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I think I learned a lot and have even more questions, but so is probably studying Russia. You never answer all the questions you have. Um, and yeah, thanks again. And I'm excited to hear from the listeners what they also think about what we discussed today.
Well, thanks a lot, Doreen. It's been really a pleasure talking to you for this past 90 minutes. And good luck with your podcast. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Perfect.